sorry, just real quick, you're gonna eventually just sit down?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
She's just gonna walk away.
Okay. I'm just curious. Well, we'll ignore you guys. So, anytime?
Yeah, sure.
Beginnings are awkward. When I beat a boss, I feel great. Like, I still get like emotional. Like, I mean,
Right.
I don't know how many times I've traded fatal blows because I'm getting over eager. We trade simultaneous fatal blows with a boss, like too much. You know, I get too like into it. Like, I can actually, it sounds stupid, I can actually feel my heart beating sometimes, and I don't have that calm composure. I'm fine with that. You know, this is fun. This is what I'm glad this game can kind of like evoke that out of me.
Yeah, for like the first 20 hours, I just wasn't feeling it.
Were you wanting something that you weren't getting in the first 20 hours? Because
Yes.
honestly, I have a feeling like so much of it looks pretty familiar. You know, I've jumped around and done a bunch of stuff. I'm like, oh, this weapon looks familiar. You know, this specific boss looks quite familiar.
It's the problem with sequels, right? Like held on its own esteem, like Dark Souls 2 is an excellent game, but when you compare it to its own, there's not too much to compare it to, but when you compare it to Demon Souls and Dark Souls, that's when I think, you know, the little tiny differences really start to like kind of splinter out, and the familiar and stuff like that. Some of it you want, some of it you don't, but it's really becoming kind of a fan-owned series much more than some other games.
You talk about how it being familiar and that sort of being a consequence of a sequel, and then you say it's a bunch of the little things adding up, and I sort of agree and disagree. I think the thing for me, you know, especially from Demon Souls to Dark Souls, there are a lot of obvious parallels that you can draw, but those are completely separate entities to me. And the feeling I get when I play either one is almost completely separate. And so when I was playing Dark Souls 2 for a while, it honestly felt like I was playing a worse Dark Souls. It didn't seem like it had that drive to throw crazy things at me in quite the way that I expected. Maybe that's just me wanting too much out of the game to an unreasonable degree, but I think that changes at some point. There is definitely a moment where the areas start to get a lot more diverse. They start to get a lot more unexpected. The things that you fight become a lot more surprising, and it just seems things get a little bit more devious. And in retrospect, I sort of understand why they took that approach, and while it may not have worked for me, I think for a lot of people, especially if you're coming into the Souls games for the first time, I think the learning curve overall is a lot smoother.
But like, I know you were kind of upset with like Dragon Rider, one of the first bosses, but I thought like that was kind of a didactic little experiment where it was easy to kind of run by all those like shielded guys, you know, which had the levers that would make the fight, so your chances of getting like ringed out was a lot less.
Something else that I was a little bit disappointed about in the beginning is, you know, we were talking about the Dragon Rider, but not just the Dragon Rider. I feel like other early bosses, including...
Hark, is that him?
Including the old Dragon Slayer, let's call him, and the Last Giant. Those three bosses are in very close proximity to each other, and my approach was make sure you block real good and circle strafe. And that didn't just apply to the bosses, that extend into other enemies as well. And I was worried that that would be my approach the entire game. And something now that I'm finding in the mid game and the late game is that there are definitely bosses where I've had to rethink that strategy, where blocking is not always the most valuable
Or even
thing.
keeping locked on's not a good tactic. Yeah, they do some like perversions of like the core systems, which is interesting, but I think just the way the game's designed, going back to the other Souls game, is that circle strafing is, I mean, part of the game. I mean, it's probably one of the detractors in some ways, but it's a trade-off. I mean, the worst is probably PvP, when it's just like the endless turtling and like the weird tango dance that happens.
But you haven't done much PvP in Dark Souls.
No, I mean the online
beta, right?
the online didn't turn on until the game actually came out, so that's why the full review didn't go up. Other people felt like it was okay to review it. I don't know. I don't want to get into a tirade here, but I think the online's pretty important to the game. Like if it was just bloodstains and messages, whatever. Even though I would say one boss is almost impossible without some online help, though I did it begrudgingly. But I feel like with the way the covenants are set up, with the 4 rings, you can almost always, if you really want to do online, you can almost always have a covenant ring on and still have your other 3 rings to help you out. I think it's really important to look into that stuff and see how it's actually working in practice, not just in theory.
Dark Souls 2, and I really, really like this, sort of has this obsession, much more so than Dark Souls 1, at throwing a lot of dudes at you at once.
Yeah, and the dudes are way more thought out. There's no guys just hunking around anymore. They're
Right.
patrolling in the Hyde's first flame. I really like that you kill that one guy, that one giant armored knight with a sword, and there's two guys protecting the hallways. You kill him or get him down to half health. The other two will like run in.
Yep.
Like that kind of dynamic stuff. I mean, we take it for granted in other games, but we really haven't seen it here before. And I think that's pretty interesting. And you even see it in like the dead corpses that rise up at you, which was not, like that's the one thing, they don't overuse anything, I feel like. And the things that were underutilized, like poison, curse, bleed, that stuff's now used to greater effect without becoming too overbearing.
I see what you mean. I think the basic fighting is a little more interesting
Right.
because of that. I still don't have a complete grasp of how much agility, the agility composite stat actually affects all of those little movements, but I think it works pretty well. It feels pretty playable. I don't think it's necessarily worse than Dark Souls or Demon Souls, and it feels really, it's similar in a lot of ways. I think it feels good.
We've talked a lot about the combat, but to me, if I had to name one thing about the original Dark Souls that left the biggest impression on me, it was the world design. And it's way different. They took a completely different approach in Dark Souls 2.
I'd say it's inverted from Dark Souls 1, where Dark Souls 1 I think was way more linear at the front. There was places you could go, but you couldn't really make progress. And this one is way more open and splintering, but then I know you haven't beat the game yet, but the end game is a lot more of a straight shot. Not exactly a straight shot, but more of a straight shot. Well, in the first game, once you got the Lord Vessel, it was like go hunt down those souls, and you had all these leads all over.
The thing that's surprising about Dark Souls 2, though, is there are a lot of dead ends. There are a lot of paths that you take that won't last very long, and you'll just get to the end and there's nowhere else you can go, and you'll have to choose another path. So it's just like, you have a tree with branches of varying lengths, which I think is way interesting, because in Dark Souls, regardless of the path you took, it usually went on for a while, or it looped back around on itself. So I think that's really interesting, and in combination with being able to warp anywhere around the world, it's both like a huge plus and I think a huge negative, depending on how you look at it. In some ways, by having just a shit ton of paths and being able to get to those points very quickly, it leads to a lot more variety.
And one of the things I like in Dark Souls is that there's a lot of optional space. There are things you can find that you don't have to see, but you see them, and there's something to experience there. There are things to get there. And it sounds like Dark Souls 2 does a pretty good job of that. When you're talking about the branches that go out, and maybe they just lead to this one thing, but maybe you don't have to kill this dude, this big dude over here.
I'd love to know for sure, but I feel like there's more treasure in general, which I think is probably going to perturb some people.
Yeah, it looked like that.
There's a lot more sparklies.
There's a lot of times when you go into a room and you're like, 4 treasure chests. Oh boy.
Yeah.
But you know what?
So many times you run into situations where you could clearly, if you just did one step up, you could climb a ledge.
I think in a lot of cases they're using that, they're showing you something on the other side, and they're like, you can't get here, but you can see what's over there, so you try to figure it out. But you're right that it does feel,
up,
yeah.
Yep.
And sometimes you jump and you'll miss it. But Ben, it's not on PS4 and Xbox One, so you have to wait for the next gen for that kind of gameplay innovation. It's only possible with. Yeah. Now I'm totally lying. That's obviously something that you could do on Dreamcast if you want. So yeah, I kind of wish they would fix that too. You can't help but notice it when you're trying to, really be and live in that world. You're gonna feel that.
Have you made it down to the gutter yet?
Yes.
The other problem is the gutter is nowhere near as dark as Tomb of the Giants.
Or as sprawling, I guess it feels.
Right, but I mean, Tomb of the Giants was, you could not see your hand in front of your face. You could only see the eerie, glowing eye sockets of dead skeletons.
Right. And
so, I don't know. I had like 2 hours and 45 minutes of torches by the end of the game. So it's like, I'm like that with Phoenix Downs though, or I guess Human Effigy.
Yeah,
it's
you hoard the things.
Yeah.
You gotta use them sometimes.
I'm a virtual hoarder.
Literally.
I remember the line being fed to me that there are gonna be times where you're gonna have to choose between vision and defense. And it's like 99% of the time, defense is the right option here.